Welcome, everyone, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the museum. I am pleased to welcome you to the first session of our series, Where They Settled, which explores different communities that Holocaust survivors built around the world. But before we begin, I would like to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. They did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust, and as a result, many survivors were not willing to speak about their experiences. But thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors here, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Every day, we're honored to carry forward their work and legacy in Los Angeles. Today, we turn our attention to a different community, the one that Holocaust survivors built in Mexico. And it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Yael Siman, who will be speaking today and sharing some of her research. Her presentation will focus on the refugees who settled in Mexico during the Holocaust years, as well as their lives afterwards. Dr. Siman earned her Ph.D. in political science from the University of Chicago, and she was a fellow of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, a research professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Iberoamericana University in Mexico City, as well as a co-author of books and articles, including the volume Holocaust and Latin America, Migration, Settlement, and Memory. She is currently conducting a research project on the migration trajectories and the memories of Holocaust survivors in Mexico. While Holocaust Museum LA is currently closed for the last phase of our construction for our expansion campaign, please follow our website as we will be doing several programs like these online about various topics, including this series. And now this is also a very unique and special opportunity for us to bring scholars from all over the world. And so it is now my honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Siman for Where They Settled, Holocaust Survivors in Mexico. Thank you so much for joining us today, and you may begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Holocaust Museum LA for this invitation. I will begin now. I will share my PowerPoint. Okay. This is a photograph of Miriam Weiss, Buba, and Lajos Luis Stillman, taken a few years ago in the Memory and Tolerance Museum in Mexico City. Buba is a survivor of the Holocaust, originally from Transylvania. She survived the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen camps. After the war, Buba went with her sister Itzu to Sweden, where they became domestic workers until their older sister Bella, who had been in Mexico since 1936, was able to bring them to this country. By this country, I mean Mexico. Buba and Itzu arrived in Mexico in 1946. Luis is a survivor of the Holocaust, originally from Hungary. He survived in a forced labor battalion and at the Mauthausen concentration camp. After the war, he worked for the UNRWA, the United Nations organization that was created to assist the refugees, and immigrated to Mexico in 1947 with the help of his maternal uncle who lived in the United States. Buba and Luis met at the Jewish Association Emuna, which brought together survivors from Germany and Hungary. They married in 1948 and spent a long life together until Luis passed away in September of 2024. He almost turned 103 years old. Buba is still alive and lives in Mexico City, and she is 99 years old. Many years after the end of the war and her arrival to Mexico, Buba began painting her remembrances of the Holocaust. This is one of her paintings that I wanted to share with you. On his part, only 2 years before his passing, Luis published his memoir, No vivirás para tu próximo cumpleaños. You will not live to see your next birthday. How common were Buba's and Luis's experiences in Mexico? How many Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors arrived in this country before, during, and after the war? Who supported them in their migration journey, and what was their arrival like in this country? How did they adapt? Did they find a new home in Mexico or left to other countries? These are some of the key questions we will explore in today's presentation. This monument was created by the Jewish community of Mexico to commemorate 100 years of Jewish immigration to the country. Located in the port of Veracruz, it symbolizes both the arrival and lasting presence of Jews in Mexico, as well as the new opportunities the country offered to Jewish immigrants. In their testimonies, Holocaust survivors express deep gratitude to a country that opened its doors to them, whether during their escape from Nazism or after surviving the genocide in Europe. This 1943 map shows that Jews fleeing Nazism arrived to almost every country in the Americas. According to the Argentine Philanthropic Association, which published this map, 324,000 Jews immigrated to the American continent between 1933 and 1943. Of this total, 101,500 settled in Latin America, but only 1,000 arrived in Mexico. In comparison, 2,850 went to Colombia, 5,000 to Bolivia, 6,000 to Cuba, 7,000 to Uruguay, 12,000 to Chile, and much higher numbers to Brazil and Argentina, 25,000 and 45,000 respectively. The number of Jewish refugees that arrived in Mexico during the Holocaust is lower in this map, as you saw, it's only 1,000, than other estimates that point out to an oscillating number between 1,850 and 2,250. Even though the number that has been estimated by these scholars is higher, is still very small. Regarding the post-war years, no precise estimates have been made. However, research conducted by Daniela Glaser and I point out only to a few hundred between 1945 and 1950. You can then see that Mexico, even though it has a very central geographical and even geopolitical position, in the Americas, it played a marginal role in receiving Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors. You can see in this slide how the immigration policy of Mexico changed from an open door policy to a semi-closed door policy. Daniela Glaser, in her book, that you can see the cover of the book in this slide, shows how a confidential circular promulgated in April of 1934 officially prohibited Jewish immigration to Mexico. But previously, other scholars such as Chaim Avni and Judith Boxer-Liberand had already demonstrated how Mexico's policy towards the Jewish refugees was both selective and restrictive. They studied Mexico's immigration policy only until about 1943. So we still don't know enough about what happened in the post-war years. But based on recent research that I've been conducting at the National Migration Archive in Mexico, I have seen that there is some continuity in Mexico's immigration policy, and many survivors were unable to come to the country, or at least not when they wanted or when their family members tried to bring them, and had to wait a few years either in Europe or several months or in transit in other countries. But Mexico was much more generous towards other refugees, such as those that escaped Franco's regime, called Spanish Republicans, who came to Mexico both during the war and after the war. Their estimates point to about 20,000 Spanish Republicans who entered Mexico during this historical moment. You see here a photograph of the Colegio de Mexico, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in Mexico, which was founded by Spanish refugees. I wanted to share this photograph with you because I found it very moving when I was doing research at Columbia University and I came across it. It is an image of the French steamer Cuba. It is from the collection of the Spanish Refugee Relief Association records. Based on these photographs' caption, we know that this ship took hundreds of refugees from France to Latin America. These refugees were not only Spanish, they were also Jewish and of different nationalities. The caption adds that, I quote, "Many of them are in rags, some have only bathrobes. Their destination is unknown because the Dominican Republic only accepted refugees that were authorized to settle in the colony of Sosua." However, the caption ends with a more positive note saying, and I quote, "It is hoped they may be taken in by Mexico or Cuba." The image is interesting for several reasons, one of which is that very different individuals shared a common experience, fleeing Europe and traveling together to a new destination. Although we don't know how much they interacted, it's possible that the ship provided a space for socializing, sharing, and connecting with each other. It has been pointed out, and I think it's an important notion, that Mexico was an Indo-American country, meaning that it had a predominantly mestizo population, the mix of European and indigenous ancestry. And but it didn't, because of that, those who didn't blend into this mix were not considered assimilable and were thus denied entry to the country. So historically, Mexico, in contrast to other Latin American countries, such as, for example, Argentina, in Mexico, foreigners made less than 1% of the national population. Here is a photograph of our president, Lázaro Cárdenas, and I decided to include this because I think it is important to take into consideration the national context to understand how in the 30s, Mexico's immigration policy changed from open to semi-closed. So this was still a post-revolutionary time. Nationalism was taking hold. The mestizo identity was the anchor of the national Mexican identity. There were very strong political divisions in Mexico. Anti-Semitism and xenophobia were very much present. And President Cárdenas nationalized, for example, the oil industry, trying to protect the national market and the national workers, as many other countries did at the time. And this brought important tensions with the United States and with the UK. This is also a photograph that reveals how racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism was taking force in Mexico. It is the pro-race committee, which was anti-Chinese and anti-Jewish. So Mexico basically is an exceptional case because it stands on two poles. On the one hand, it was very generous towards certain groups, and on the other hand, it was selective and restrictive towards others. So one of the questions that we've been trying to address already for several years while we research this population of refugees and survivors is the following. Given that Mexico had a policy of semi-closed doors to Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors, what explains that nearly 2,500 were able to enter the country? So this is a graph that I created based on a database that is still not completed. And it actually begins with, well, it shows the number of Jewish refugees and survivors that came to Mexico. between 1933 and the 1990s. However, I have to say that the first year that I have a record for of a refugee coming to Mexico is 1937. And then the last year of an entry by a survivor is 1992. But well, and I have to say that the graph is based on different sources, archives, oral histories, among others. And it shows that there are two interesting peaks in this period. One is in 1940, and the other one is in 1947. And the question is why? So I am not entirely sure about that. I'm trying to address that question, but I have some hypotheses. I think that both years might be revealing this peak because of the urgency either to flee Nazism or for survivors to leave Europe, where they felt that they couldn't return to their communities, but also communism was getting stronger and pogroms were taking place, etc. But also the world was pretty much mobilized and felt a very strong compassion towards these survivors. So it might have been that humanitarianism played a certain role in the public officials' decisions to allow some survivors to enter the country even in 1947. Also in 1940, President Lázaro Cárdenas was still in office, but he didn't have much time left. That was the last year of his administration. And we do know that some refugees arrived in 1941. Some of them came alone, individuals. Some of them came with family. Some of them came as part of some collectives or groups. For instance, in December 1941, the steamer Serpa Pinto arrived at the port of Veracruz carrying 192 refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And among the small number who arrived in 1942, some had already been in transit months before reaching Mexico, some in Cuba, others in Martinique. Some were in a condition of sort of limbo because they could not leave these places until finally their family members were able to arrange that the visa procedure, that it would come to fruition, but also some decided to come without the proper documentation and took important risks. Between 1943 and 1945, we see barely refugees coming to Mexico, as to many other places. There is a record of only 31 Polish Jews who were admitted to Mexico during these 2 years. So who were these refugees and survivors? In the 1930s and 1940s, a group of German and Austrian intellectuals, writers, and artists came to Mexico as scientists. Some of them actually returned to Europe after the war to rebuild Europe. In the post-war years, Polish survivors formed the largest number, but survivors that came to Mexico also came from Hungary or the Baltic states, Western European countries such as France, and also some Sephardic survivors who came from Greece and Bulgaria, among other places. They came from different cities and towns. They had diverse occupations and ages. There were women and men. They had had different Holocaust experiences. They belonged to different social classes. They had different Jewish identities. Some were secular Jews, some were communists, etc. Some were actually orphaned child survivors, and here I wanted to share with you some of the photos that were very generously given to me or lent to me. I don't have them now, I returned them, but they were lent to me so they could be published in this book that you can see the cover, which Michael mentioned before, The Holocaust and Latin America, Migration, Resettlement, and Memory, which we published this year. So you can see first the photograph of Elena Sondovich, who came to Mexico. She was the only child, and she lost her parents in the Holocaust. She was rescued by a Catholic family. Then you see Peter Katz. Those are his adoptive parents in Belgium. They were Jewish. He was in a kinder transport from Vienna to Belgium. And then the last photo is that of Noemi Nikin, holding the hands of her parents, who also perished in the Holocaust. And she, like the others, came to Mexico because a family member was able to bring them. So how and why they entered Mexico? How were they able to overcome many obstacles for the most part? So first, I would like to mention why they came to Mexico. What were the reasons? What are the reasons they give for coming to Mexico? So one of them that appears very prominently in their testimonies and memoirs is that they had relatives in Mexico. They also mention political contacts and political organizations that helped them. Some of them mentioned that they came to Mexico only in transit to the United States. Some also mentioned that they really wanted to go to the United States, but they ended up in Mexico. Some mentioned that Mexico was the only available option, that was the only visa that they could get. Some mentioned that it was mere chance or prevailing circumstances that worked in their favor. And very few say that they knew something about Mexico, or as I mentioned, suggested before, that they had a strong desire to come to this country. So here we have photographs of the Boton family. We see Flora in the first photograph, and then we see Julio and Dolly. So Flora and Julio Boton are Greek Jews who survived the Holocaust with their parents and their paternal grandmother in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And they, in their testimonies, both of them mention several factors leading to their family migration to Mexico. They mention language because they spoke, as they say, Jewish Spanish or Judeo-Español. They both say that it's called Ladino, but it should be called Judeo-Español. Well, their parents did not know English, and that would have made it very difficult for them to go to the United States. They also mentioned that they had a Spanish passport, which made acquiring Mexican citizenship easier. And they had family and friends in Mexico who told them that conditions were good in this country and that the father, Jaime, would be able to establish a new business. So Flora and her parents came to Mexico in 1949, while Julio arrived a year later. Dolly, on the other hand, survived the Holocaust hidden with her mom. She lost her father in the Holocaust. She emigrated to the United States and came to Mexico when she married Julio. Here we have another family, the Davidsons. They came to Mexico in 1947. They received help from the Bundists. They didn't have family in Mexico. Their family was in the United States. Hannah Davidson wrote this memoir, East of the Storm, outrunning the Holocaust in Russia. They ended up moving to, I believe, to Texas. And in this memoir, she writes the following. I think is very illustrative of what their experience, their migration experience, but also their expectations, their dreams, the known, the unknown, etc., of the post-war period. So she wrote, a letter on a day in April 1947, a letter from Paris arrived. Father anxiously picked it up and started to read aloud. The Mexican embassy acknowledges that visas for the Davidson family have arrived. For the first few months, we were silent. Then we hugged each other as tears ran down our cheeks. Our departure from Europe was a reality, and it was overwhelming. We had imagined ourselves in New York, where we had family and friends, not in the wild country of Mexico, with horses and cowboys in the streets, which is what our limited information suggested. So families in Mexico went to great lengths to bring their relatives from Europe before the war, during the war, and after the war. They provided funds for the processing of visas and the purchase of ship tickets. They mobilized political contacts and hired lawyers. But even in cases where relatives not only put enormous effort into bringing the refugees and survivors, but also had the economic means to do so, the Mexican government refused their entry or delayed their arrival. One emblematic example is that of Arturo Wolfowitz, who was a naturalized Mexican since 1925 and the chairman of the Central Committee of the Jewish Community of Mexico. Despite his position of leadership and his political contacts, the Ministry of Interior repeatedly turned down his request to allow his brother Max and his family to immigrate to Mexico. This case is also particularly striking given that Magdalena, Arturo's niece, had been born in Mexico and thus had the right to enter the country. Following various requests, the Wolfowitz family finally arrived on the 2nd of March, 1942. Danielle Wolfowitz, who was a young girl at the time, put it perhaps better than anyone, and I quote, "Thank God my uncle Arturo was here. Otherwise, we would never have gotten out." Other helpers in Mexico were not relatives. They could be people who the refugees or survivors met once they already arrived in Mexico, or people who were contacted through a third person or someone who they invested money with, etc. So this is the case, for example, of Matt Shane, who was a successful businessman who came from the United States and married the sister of the Mexican president's wife, Consuelo. On this slide, we see two important historical documents. At the top, on the left side, is the immigration identity card of Enrique Asher Oppenheimer, who was born in Germany and immigrated to Mexico in 1938. Below, we see a 1939 letter from Max Shane to the Mexican Minister of Interior requesting authorization to hire Mr. Asher as the director of his toy factory. Asher was granted permission and went on to work for Shine for several years. This was made possible only after his immigration status was changed from tourist to immigrant. In a recent article that I published with Daniela Glaser, last year, we traced the journeys of 30 Jewish families that escaped Nazism, and we found that many of them were able to come to Mexico because they took advantage of the loopholes in the law, opportunities for corruption, family and political networks, and the immense efforts of the refugees themselves, which helped them overcome, like I said, very important obstacles and challenges. So regarding corruption, this is a book that's been published in Spanish. It's called Los Otros, The Other, but I think historian Pablo Yankelevich explains in great depth how corruption is a systemic practice or has been a systemic practice in Mexico, and how led to the foreign immigrant to be the privileged victim of extortion, as well as a constant source of bribes. And this is actually told by many survivors and refugees in their testimonies and memoirs, but I chose one by Stefan Kalmar because I think it's very poignant. So he says, and I quote, "And we were taken to Mexico, to Veracruz in that boat." It was actually the Siboney via New York. "And we had a lot of trouble in landing Veracruz. It was not easy. Afterwards, I heard that we were the only ones that land without bribing the immigration officers there or having been expected by relatives or others who had arranged the release. We didn't expect that we had to do that, and we were the last of the boat to get out." By the way, Stefan Kalmar, I mentioned him before. He came from Sweden to Mexico. Several institutions and figures also helped the refugees and the survivors immigrate to Mexico. They include consulates and diplomatic legations, shipping companies, bureaucrats, international Jewish and non-Jewish aid organizations such as HIAS, Joint, OSCE, the Jewish Labor Committee, Emergency Rescue Committee, the League of Pro-German Culture, etc. They also include good public officials contacts, lawyers, etc. Who were the lucky ones? So among the lucky ones, we find the story of Fini Constat and Stefan Kalmar. Actually, I think I didn't mention Kalmar before. I'm mentioning him right now. So Fini and her parents were displaced from Vienna, Austria, and lived in Istanbul, Turkey, and Bombay, India, before managing to board a ship with a group of non-Jewish Poles bound for Mexico. Unlike most refugees, the Fogel family did not travel across the Atlantic. Instead, they took a much longer route through the Pacific. The family had hoped to enter the United States, but were unable to do so, and had to temporarily settle at the Santa Rosa estate, which had been converted into a refugee camp. It was 1943. Sometime later, Finney was taken in by a Jewish family in Mexico, followed shortly afterwards by her parents. Stefan Kalmar and his wife Edith also left Vienna, Austria, but traveled to Sweden. They settled in Stockholm for 2 years before immigrating to Mexico with the help of a Swedish socialist newspaper and the Swedish Jewish community. Stefan and Edith, who was 8 months pregnant with their first child, arrived in Mexico on February 24, 1940. But unlike the Fogels, the Kalmars re-emigrated from Mexico after the war. I will show later they went to Australia, and several years later, they ended up in California, United States. A group of Jewish Germans and Austrians composed of left-wing political intellectuals, artists, writers, and scientists was established in Mexico as a result of President Cárdenas' support. Cárdenas highly valued the political activism of these exiles, both Jewish and non-Jewish, considering them worth rescuing because of their opposition to totalitarianism and their defense of democratic ideals. Some members of this group were Stalinist communists who had been denied entry to the United States. Political organizations in both the US and Mexico played an important role in supporting these refugees. A small number of Jews who were not part of this intellectual exile also obtained visas to Mexico as political refugees, which is interesting to find out why. And I wanted to tell you that this slide features a flyer for a conference against fascism organized by labor leader Vicente Lombardo Toledano. These are copies of the documents showing that German writer Anne Segers and her Hungarian husband scientist Laszlo Radványi had registered with the National Registry of Foreigners in Mexico. Following the incarceration of Laszlo in a concentration camp in France, the League of American Writers, Friends, and Comrades helped them immigrate to Mexico. They arrived with their 2 children at the port of Veracruz. They were not linked to the local Jewish community and instead participated in local cultural organizations such as the Heinrich Heine Club. And Laszlo was a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Both Anne and Laszlo obtained their Mexican citizenship in 1946, but decided to return to Europe. This map appears in Tabea Linhart's book, Unexpected Routes, Refugee Writers in Mexico, published by Stanford University Press in 2023. It traces Segers' non-linear journey from Berlin to Zurich, then to Paris, followed by Marseille. On her way to the Americas, Segers and her family stopped in Casablanca, Morocco, before continuing to Martinique, the Dominican Republic, and several smaller Caribbean islands. They eventually reached Ellis Island, where they were denied entry to the United States. They finally arrived in Mexico in 1941. This is the novel that Segers wrote while in Mexico called Transit. And it was first published in Spanish and English, and only later it was published in German. But I think it's a beautiful novel. There's also a film based on this novel. And in it, Segers draws on her own experience as a refugee, but she also evokes the shared experience of many others for whom transit from Europe to unknown destinations was filled with uncertainty, fear, rumors, and hope. Migration routes to Mexico during the war and after the war were very varied. So before the war, some traveled from Hamburg, Germany to the port of Veracruz in Mexico, making several stops along the Atlantic Ocean and in the Caribbean. During the war, routes often began in Marseille or Lisbon with multiple stops, including Casablanca, Martinique, Havana, and other places. While many arrived at the port of Veracruz, others entered through alternative routes and ports, such as Manzanillo, Colima, or Tampico, Tamaulipas. Some crossed into Mexico by land, either through the northern US-Mexico border or the southern Guatemala-Mexico border. Entry was made by ship, train, or other available means of transportation, and there were both legal and irregular or unauthorized entries. Some individuals tried desperately to immigrate to Mexico after the war, but were not granted a visa. This was the case of the Seichberts, who, despite having a close relative living in Mexico since 1941, the maternal uncle whose name was Jerzy Halamski, they were unable to enter the country and instead resettled in Caracas, Venezuela. This photograph shows the Hannah, Leon, Brony, and Ignacy in the ship the Mont Falcon during their journey from France to the United States. Those who came to Mexico and later gave a testimony or wrote their memoirs, whether published or unpublished, have represented Mexico as a beautiful and free country. They romanticize Mexico, although I have to say Mexico is beautiful, but you do find this romanticization of the country when they arrived. So they also say that Mexico was a welcoming country, that people were especially warm, that there were, however, that there was good climate, that they had to adjust to food, but that food was interesting, good, exotic. However, there were plenty of difficulties or things they didn't like. For example, it was really hard for those not speaking Judeo-Espanol or Ladino to learn the language. There were some very strong social class divisions that have always existed in Mexico, but for some European refugees or survivors were uncomfortable to them. And for example, one quote from a testimony of the testimony of Flora Boton, who I mentioned earlier, she says the following: "I was a European adolescent with nothing in common with the Mexican Jewish girls. Mexico was not regarded as civilized, unlike Europe. Foreigners were stigmatized and rejected according to their recollections, and survivors were seen as harmed individuals." There were both happy and unhappy arrivals. For some, arriving in Mexico was a joyous moment. It was for them the opportunity to reunite with their relatives. But for others, it was really hard, even when they reunited with relatives, because they felt they didn't share the same values or habits. That was especially the case of those child survivors that I mentioned, especially of two of them. And for example, in the 1996 interview, Fini Fogel recalls that from there, they actually went, as I said, through the Pacific. They arrived in San Francisco or near Berkeley, I believe. And from there, they took a train. They went to Ciudad Juárez City, the border city, and from there to León, Guanajuato. And she says where they arrived at a sort of a concentration camp. Although it wasn't that, she says it was a camp, and they had to stay there. And then she refers to Santa Rosa as a place where she faced anti-Semitism from the Catholic Poles who came with the Jews on this ship and were placed in the same camp. But also she was fearful, and her parents especially were fearful because she was a young girl, so she was especially vulnerable. Now, in the post-war years, so we have here the migration identity cards of both Buba Weiss and Itzu Weiss. Both sisters survived together in Auschwitz, in Bergen-Belsen, and these are the two sisters. And then later, in April of 1945, as they were being liberated, they chose to go to Sweden, and they became domestic workers until they were able to reconnect with their sister Bella in Mexico. All the children in this family, 5 of them, were alive after the war, except for the parents who were assassinated in Auschwitz. And both of them actually in their testimony tell how they were told by their sister Bella, who they adored and missed so much and were so happy to see, that they should keep silence, that they shouldn't talk about the Holocaust. But Patricia, Buba and Luis's daughter, says that in fact they did share their stories. So that's why I wrote, they found multiple ways to tell their stories. But they didn't give public testimony until much later. So this is a screenshot of Itzu giving her testimony to the Shoah Foundation in 1996. Now, what types of visa they got and how did that change over time? So some got family immigrant visas that allow them to only temporarily stay in Mexico. Others were able to get the inmigrado, which already allowed them to have permanent residency, and they usually obtain this after 5 years of having a legal temporary residence in Mexico. Some were able to seek political asylum. They were political refugees. Some were tourists. Some got investor visas. And the type of visa that they had either restricted the possibility to work or allowed them to work, but also set limitations on what jobs they could have and where they could live. Some acquired Mexican nationality, but it took them many years to become Mexicans through naturalization. Some remained stateless their entire life. And of course, marrying a Mexican made things easier. I'm almost finished. And many, actually, the moment they arrived to Mexico, contacted the Jewish community. They sought assistance, economic, legal, etc. Some decided to belong to a synagogue and send their children to Jewish schools. But in Mexico, we do have 4 different axes, let's say ethnic axes of belonging, whether the person was Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or whether that person came from Aleppo or Damascus. We do have, and we had then, and we have now, schools and synagogues based on those identity reference. Their families in Mexico also helped them get housing and jobs. As I mentioned before, Germans and Hungarians belong to 2 organizations, Emuna, which was a Colonia Húngaro-Alemana, German-Hungarian colony, and Menora, Association of German-speaking Israelites. And others felt more comfortable in non-Jewish settings where they interacted with other refugees, such as Flora and Julio Botón, but also our current president's family, Claudia Sheinbaum's. So here we have 2 cases of 2, a refugee and a survivor, who came to Mexico in very different moments, and yet they decided to belong to these 2 organizations, Menora and Emuna. And I took like a screenshot of an article that was recently published in the New York Times. The writer is Brett Stephens, about both Luis and Buba. And Luis's article is titled, "You Will Not Live to See Your Next Birthday," just like the title of his memoir. And for many, Mexico became a new home, but for others, Mexico was a transit destination. A few chose to return to Europe after the war. Some did not adapt to Mexico and left. But we can say that for the most part, Mexico became a permanent new home. And now we return to where we began, the photograph of Buba and Luis, and the question of whether their experiences were representative of others. I'd like to conclude by emphasizing that while each story is unique, certain patterns emerge, both during the war and in the post-Holocaust period, regarding the migration of Jewish refugees and survivors to Mexico. For example, despite the country's semi-closed immigration policy, many found ways to navigate bureaucratic obstacles and overcome what was often a hostile environment towards foreigners and Jews in particular. Mexico was both generous and challenging. While families and communities made great efforts to support refugees and survivors, they did not always know how to help them adapt to their new and complex reality. Jewish refugees and survivors carried their Holocaust memories with them. And although they were often urged to remain silent, over time they found ways to share their stories through a distinctly Mexican lens. Though the Jewish refugee population in Mexico was relatively small compared to other countries, it was diverse and still understudied. There is much more to explore, particularly regarding age, gender, political mobilization, activism, among other important themes, and their personal narratives as well. But based on existing research, it is clear that Mexico and the Holocaust remain deeply interconnected through the experiences of migration, settlement, and memory of these individuals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us, for sharing such extensive research and such a meaningful story. And I would like to invite those listening today to use the Q&A box on your screen to ask questions, and we do have time for questions. And just while we're thinking of some questions, I wanted to actually just share with you that you mentioned the Julio Boton a few times. About 7 or 8 years ago, he actually came to Los Angeles and visited the museum, and we had the opportunity to meet him and interact with him and learn a little bit about his story. So I was pleased to hear you mention his name.
I have to say, Michael, that as I was reading some of their stories, is profoundly moving because I've become very close friend of many of them. And as we lose them, it becomes really, really sad because they are amazing people, human beings, professionals, teachers, mentors, etc. So thank you for mentioning him. I don't know if Dolly is listening or Aliki, Julio and Dolly's daughter. I told them maybe they could listen, but
Well, this is recorded and it will be on the museum's YouTube channel, which maybe will answer this question we have. We have a question about if you have a list of the books mentioned tonight. So you'll be able to play this recording back eventually, but also if you have a list handy, feel free to email it and I can pass it on to the attendees.
I
Um,
do. Some of them I are in English, which is good. Some of them are in Spanish, but I can share both because maybe some people do understand Spanish.
Thank you. One question we have is, did most of the Jewish immigrants try to leave Mexico at the same stage?
So at the same moment. So that explains the emigration of the political exile because they were very much ideologically motivated to go back to Europe and rebuild Europe from the ashes. And they were passionate about it. And so Anne Segers returned, Leo Zuckerman returned. Actually, the professor Friedrich Katz, his parents emigrated to the US, didn't go back to Europe. So, but they felt very much connected with Europe. So for them, I think Mexico was an ideal refuge site because they could be together and continue with their very creative work, but at the same time, it had an impact on them, as you can see in Seger's writings. But they always hoped to go back home. For others, I cannot say there was a moment where people left because of shared reasons. I think it was more individual, except much later, as part of the migration from Mexico because of economic crisis or lack of security, etc. But that was later, not in the 50s or in the 60s. That came later.
Thank you. How was the integration of the Ashkenazi Jews arriving in Mexico with the Sephardic and Arab Jews who had already been living there?
So that's right. I mean, the first ones, I mean, to arrive in the 20th century, because we had Jewish migration before, but yes, they came from the Ottoman Empire and they founded the first institutions in Mexico. And initially they prayed together and then they split up and they weren't even sharing the same synagogue, and they started creating their own spaces of belonging. So it's not that they did not have any contact with each other. They did, but in terms of socializing and yes, feeling sort of like in a known place, in a safe place of belonging, they actually connected with what was known to them. So Sephardic Jews would join the Monterrey synagogue, for example, and the Ashkenazi Jews would join the Keile. So, and they spoke different languages, and it's fascinating to hear in their testimonies how they speak about each other. Like they were different. They spoke Yiddish and we couldn't understand, or the others say, well, they spoke Ladino and that was not my lingua franca, and they had different traditions and so forth. And so it's they kept their, let's call their, I don't know, borders or cultural borders among them, but they still interacted also as survivors. And actually, I didn't mention, but they created a survivor association in the 1960s, led by another survivor, Dunia Wasserstrom, who came to Mexico several years after the war. She first lived in France with her husband, and only a few years later she came to Mexico. And she became very public from the very beginning and shared her story. And then she founded this group. And however, in the beginning, and that's another axis of belonging, only those who had survived in concentration camps or death camps or ghettos belonged to these groups. And others were not considered survivors, neither by these survivors nor by themselves. And even in a very recent interview that I conducted with Arthur Weisel, he told me he never joined this group because he was not a survivor, because he was able to flee Germany and was not in a concentration camp. So these categories were very much present, even, I would say, even today for some people.
Thank you. A few people are interested in learning about the what's the current Jewish population in Mexico today, and is this population mostly in Mexico City?
So yeah, so the Jewish, that would entail another talk. It's complex, but the Jewish community today is formed of about 40,000, 45,000 Jews. I belong to this community, so that's why I say we live mainly in Mexico City, but there is a small community in Monterrey, Nuevo León, and a tiny, I cannot even call it community today. There was, but today it's not a community, only a few families that live in Guadalajara, the city of Guadalajara, and a few younger people have left to Cancun or Valle de Bravo, but only a few isolated cases. So yes, for the most part, we live in Mexico City, and actually the refugees and the survivors that came to Mexico in the beginning, most of them also settled in Mexico City, but some of them actually went to other places. And Arthur Weisel actually says how they lived in Orizaba, Veracruz for several years. And that was related to the limitations that the visa set on them. So they could not live in Mexico City if they wanted to work. And they were very honest and they respected the law, because others would bypass the law and move to Mexico City to be near the Jewish institutions.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here about the Mexican government allowing in various people during the 30s, specifically on one hand, Marxists and socialists, and then on the other hand, the fact that Mexico supported or Mexico's support of Spain in the 30s. So if you could please elaborate on those two groups.
So yes, I mean, as I said before, President Cárdenas was a left-wing president who highly valued anyone who defended democracy and fought against fascism. So that's why, in part, why explains why he opened Mexico's door to the Spanish Republican refugees who resisted the Franco totalitarian regime and sought also a way of surviving through migration. And Mexico, for many reasons, including the language, and also this ideological connection through the government was let's say, very favorable. Then other political left-wing actors that were not Spaniard were also favored by this left-wing pro-democracy ideology of Cárdenas himself. And thus, that explains why people like Seger, Zuckerman, Katz, etc., were able to come to Mexico as political refugees. So the issue of being Jewish was not an issue for them because they were political refugees. But for those who were not politically engaged, they were not, and also not did not have the connections. So then it was much more harder to get a visa because they were not considered refugees. They were considered immigrants, even though they faced horrific threats. And therefore, they would be subjected to Mexico's restrictive and selective immigration law. I hope I explained it.
Yes, thank you so much. One question we have going back to the Jewish population in Mexico today is whether or not there's a museum in Mexico, similar, a Holocaust museum or a museum that focuses on this particular history.
So yeah, so actually people think the Memory and Tolerance Museum that exists in Mexico today was the first Holocaust museum created in Mexico, but that's not right. I mean, it's a wonderful museum. It's impressive. Hopefully you can all visit the museum someday. It has a very large Holocaust exhibit, and then it has exhibits on other genocides, and at the very end, a large exhibit on tolerance. However, in the 1970s, a Holocaust museum, which only focused on the Holocaust and mainly the Jewish experience, was housed in the Keilah, in the neighborhood called Condesa, where many Jews settled at some point in our history in Mexico. And however, the earthquake of, I believe it was 2017, damaged the building and they had to destroy it and they took out everything that was in the exhibit. And fortunately, that's recent news, all the boxes were brought to the Center for Jewish Documentation and Research, and the director, Tessie Schlosser, got a grant. So these materials, some of them are objects from the Holocaust, can be preserved and also accessed by researchers. So that's basically the history of these Holocaust museums in Mexico.
Thank you so much. And we have time for a couple more questions. One question is, if you can please elaborate as to the differences with Argentina and why Argentina seemed to welcome so many more Jews and other Europeans after the war.
So yes, I mean, that has to do with, first of all, a history of Argentina being open to immigration. But it's not only that, because it's really more complex, because at some point, the immigration of Jews was also restricted by the Argentine government. But many were able to enter through irregular channels. and many went to other Latin American countries and then were able to enter Argentina through these porous frontiers. So also, I have to say, Argentina had the largest Jewish community. So you needed networks. You needed someone to help you get a visa, right? So in Argentina there was a critical mass, and these Jews who were already actually arrived in Argentina before, much before Jews in Mexico. It was a more similar migration to the U.S. And they had established institutions. They were able to mobilize many kinds of resources in order to bring their relatives from Europe. So all of that played a part, but it is a complex history too.
Thank you. And is there anything you can add about the non-Ashkenazi survivors? You mentioned earlier specifically that Ladino was maybe a factor that made it easier for them, but is there anything that you might be able to add about that community of survivors?
So, I started learning more about them because those were not the survivors that I first encountered because I don't belong to the Sephardic community. So, I've been listening to their testimonies that are fascinating. For example, Alberto Bejarano, who came to Mexico from Bulgaria after the war, and he talks about how they survived in Bulgaria in, let's say, I mean, very difficult conditions, but not as horrible as the conditions that prevailed in Salonika. So also there are very important differences in terms of Holocaust experiences for those who came from Greece or those who came from Bulgaria. They had some relatives or friends already living in Mexico, so also that was a reason for them to come to this country. And once they came to Mexico, I think then they blended into the same spaces of belonging, whether that was the synagogue or the school, because there was, not anymore, but there was a Sephardic school for many, many years. So they would send their children to these schools, and at home they would speak not only Ladino, but I know Julio and Dolly spoke Greek. So among them, and their daughters have Greek names. So that tells you a lot about how this Greek Sephardic identity was kept and transmitted to the next generation. And I assume the same with the Bejarano family, but I haven't been in touch with them the same way as I've been with the Boton family. But there's plenty more to learn. So, I mean, that's a research question, what you asked.
Thank you. Um, one of our viewers would like to know what the anti-Semitism is like today in Mexico, having a president with Jewish background.
So, when she was campaigning for office, there were some anti Semitic attacks, but I don't think it really hurt the Jewish community. And I think they were overcome because of the very strong support that she had from the previous president, AMLO. And she is a strong figure. She is a strong woman, and she has political power, I believe. And so nothing to really be afraid of at the time. It's more challenging what's happening now because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and then the left in Mexico, and not everyone in the left, a sector that's more radical has its own agenda, and then it's becoming more worrisome. I don't think it feels threatening, but I do feel it's worrisome.
Thank you. And to conclude, one of our attendees is interested in knowing a little bit about your family background. You mentioned that you live in Mexico and that you're part of the Ashkenazi community. So if you could share a little bit about your family background, please.
So yes, I'm happy to do that very briefly. So maybe my dad is listening to my talk, so he could say much more. But and I don't know if my mom also. So my grandparents came from Poland and Russia, but my maternal grandmother was born in Mexico, which is something fairly rare because usually her generation was were all immigrants, and they spoke Yiddish at home. My grandfather didn't speak Russian with his daughters. They had four daughters. And what else can I say? I mean, in terms of belonging, I don't feel I have a very deep sense of belonging to neither Poland nor Russia. But I am interested in finding out more about those roots. And unfortunately, we lost the wisdom of the Yiddish after a few generations. That's so unfortunate, and I'm so sad because it could be also so useful for my research, and I can only understand a few words here and there. But Yiddish was very much present in our family. It was spoken at home. I remember in the one of the main parks, Parque Mexico, you could hear Yiddish. I remember when I was young, and you could hear those immigrants speaking Yiddish there. So they created also their own spaces of belonging in the park. So that's basically my, in very few words, my history. But I was born and raised in Mexico City.
Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Seaman, for such a well-researched and meaningful presentation. I know that our audiences were learned so much, and you can tell by the questions that we received in the comments that people were so interested to learn about this part of Holocaust history. And I want to thank everyone so much for tuning in today. As mentioned earlier, Holocaust Museum LA is currently closed as we finish our final phase of construction for the new Jonah Goldrich campus. But during our closure, we are offering a variety of online programs, both for the public and for students. So you can follow our website to see what we have coming up. And specifically, I wanted to just mention that the next two chapters of this series will be October 23rd, the Holocaust survivor community in South Africa, focusing on the city of Cape Town, and December 3rd, Sweden, with scholars from both places who will be sharing a similar research. And this is a way that we can connect to these communities all over the world and learn about what the communities that Holocaust survivors built. And again, I want to thank everyone so much for joining. And Dr. Seaman, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your research.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.